Welcome to Sleepy History Tales. Tonight, we're taking a journey unlike any other, not through lands, but through some of history's most shocking endings. Deaths that will make you say, really? Did that really happen? From ancient warriors who chose fire over surrender, to inventors who were killed by their own inventions, deaths in history are not only tragic, but sometimes poetic. Before we begin, please take a second to like the video and subscribe to the channel if you find this content worthwhile. And don't hesitate to leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, and what time it is where you are. It's great to see people from all over listening to these stories together. Now, dim the lights, turn on a fan for some background noise if you want, and let's quietly embark on this journey tonight. The story of Mithridates VI. The first story takes us back to the 1st century BC, to Mithridates VI, king, warrior, and master of languages, but also a man so obsessed with the fear of assassination that he turned himself into a living experiment. As ruler of the kingdom of Pontus, he lived in constant fear, quite appropriate for an ancient king. In those days, poison was almost a staple of royal banquets, quick, convenient, and very in vogue. To cope, Mithridates began micro-injecting himself with every poison that could kill him. A little hemlock, a little arsenic, then belladonna. He transformed his body into a fortress against poison. His physicians even created Mithridatium, a legendary antidote that would be sought after by medieval physicians for more than a millennium. Then Rome came along. They didn't care about his experiments, they wanted land. After many bloody battles, Mithridates was betrayed and cornered. Not wanting to be led back to Rome as a disgraced prisoner, he chose to die by poison, his old friend. Only, it didn't work. After years of poison resistance, his body no longer responded. Like a cook immune to fire, he discovered that he had overcome death itself in a very ironic way. Finally, he turned to a mercenary and ordered, "Plan B, finish it yourself." And so the king who could not die by poison was killed by the sword, simple, brutal, and inevitable. A gentle reminder that no matter how well you prepare, fate always keeps a rusty blade handy, just in case. The story of Sigurd the Mighty. Next, we come to a bloody Viking tale, with beheadings, pride, and teeth. Meet Sigurd Eystein, aka Sigurd the Mighty, a 9th century Norwegian earl. He ruled the Orkney Islands with an iron fist, never missing an opportunity to show his dominance. Sigurd had a feud with a Scottish nobleman named Mael Brigtee, nicknamed Bucktooth, and yes, this will come back to him in a very unforgettable way. They dueled, each bringing 40 men, but Sigurd didn't play fair, he brought 80. The result? A massacre of the opposing faction. Sigurd, in triumph, beheaded Brigtee and hung it from his saddle, a trophy that swayed as he rode home. But fate had a legendary move in store. As he rode across the field, Brigtee's head swayed, and a huge tooth accidentally cut his leg. A small scratch, seemingly nothing. But this was the 9th century. No antibiotics, no antiseptics, no bandages. The wound got infected, and so, Sigurd the mighty Viking warrior, died by the teeth of his enemy. History is full of tragic and unbelievable deaths. Sigurd thought he had won, but ironically, the real winner was the tooth of the enemy he had beheaded. Brigtee may have lost the battle, but he certainly won the personal battle. This is the kind of story you would think could only happen in mythology. A warrior punished for his arrogance, brought down by the smallest and most ironic detail. A bite from the past. Although Viking mythology is full of dramatic deaths, burning ships, curses from angry gods. Few endings are as tragic and humorous as Sigurd's. He returned a hero, and became the butt of jokes in one of history's strangest obituaries. The lesson? Even if you win, check your saddle. And if possible, don't hang the head of your enemy next to you, because you never know who's planning something. Pyrrhus of Epirus. Great, in the worst way. Now comes the man who won a war so badly that he lost it himself. Pyrrhus of Epirus. No ordinary noble. Pyrrhus was the cousin of Alexander the Great, a military genius and a perpetual nightmare to Rome. He was famous for his Pyrrhic victories, that is, he technically won, but suffered such heavy losses that he would have been better off at home folding laundry. After years of fighting, shouting at war elephants and engaging in honorable battles, Pyrrhus arrived in the city of Argos, where he became involved in another Greek conflict. In the middle of the night, of course, because why not? The plan was bold. The reality was chaotic. The elephants were stuck in narrow alleys. The soldiers were lost, and Pyrrhus, the great general, ended up staggering around an alleyway swinging his sword like a drunken tourist in his armor. Death by roof tile. Upstairs, an old woman watches the chaos from the roof. We don't know her name, but one thing is certain. She has a point of view, and she has a tile. With remarkable precision, as if she had thrown many things at chickens, grandchildren, or other invading kings, she drops the tile. The general falls like a bag of rotten potatoes. An enemy soldier, whether out of panic or opportunity, rushes in and finishes him off. And so, the survivor of so many wars, who once made Rome tremble, is finally sent to dust by an old Greek woman and a common building material. There is no monument to the old woman, no medal for the most effective architectural weapon in urban warfare, but honestly, there should be. Pyrrhus is now a cautionary tale. No matter how big your army is, gravity always wins. Rasputin, history's most dramatic death. And finally, Grigory Rasputin, Russian mystic, unofficial healer, and a man with a formidable beard. His death is the gold standard for the phrase, overkill. Rasputin didn't just cause political trouble, it was almost metaphysical. Imagine this. A guy shows up to a party, refuses to leave, keeps talking about souls, and somehow manages to captivate the host and all the female guests. In this case, the host is Tsar Alexandra, and the party is a crumbling empire. The Russian aristocracy can't take it anymore. At first they try to take it easy, but Rasputin doesn't know what easy is. So they move on to assassination. Plan A. Poisoning. They baked cakes and stuffed them with enough cyanide to kill the entire village. Rasputin finished, smiled, and asked for more. The organizer began to sweat. Switch to Plan B. Shoot. They shot him in the chest. Rasputin collapsed. Success. They went to check. Big mistake. He jumped up like a horror movie villain and screamed. Someone must have dropped the glass now. And then Plan C. Shoot again. They fired again. He collapsed again. But it wasn't over yet. Rasputin began to crawl. Yes, crawl, trying to escape from the palace. Why not? When had bullets ever stopped him before? Rasputin. The final battle with nature. When all the plans had been carried out, poison, shoot, beat, and Rasputin was still crawling away like he had won the lottery instead of being murdered, his attackers began to run out of ideas. Plan D. Tie him up. Drag him to the ice. Throw him in. Just to be sure, you know. But then, one final twist. When his body was found downstream, his hands were clawing at the ice above. It looked like he was still alive underwater, still searching for a way out, of course, because this was Rasputin. He survived not only poison, bullets, beatings, but also drowning. If someone said they tried to drive garlic or a wooden stake into their heart and it didn't work, you wouldn't be surprised, would you? The lesson? Never underestimate a man with a strange smell, a vague religion, and skin that seems to be forged from iron. Chrysippus, the philosopher who died of laughter. On to a gentler death, literally. Death by too much fun. Meet Chrysippus of Soli, a Stoic philosopher who spent his life pondering logic, ethics, and occasionally watching donkeys eat fruit. One fine day, perhaps between two lectures on the nature of existence, he came across a donkey nibbling on figs. Apparently he was in a good mood, so he turned to his servant and said, "Give that donkey some wine for dessert." And then, he laughed. Not the gentle laugh of a philosopher, but a roaring, breathless, tearful laugh, laughing until he died. Yes, one of the teachers of emotional control was brought down by laughter. A final stroke of fate, ironic and lovely. Franz Reichelt, The Tailor and the Fatal Flight. Finally, we come to a story that is both inspiring and a warning. Never let big ideas overshadow the laws of physics. Franz Reichelt, an Austrian tailor living in Paris in the early 20th century, didn't just sew clothes. He wanted to sew history. His dream. A coat that could fly. A kind of parachute jacket, a fusion of fashion and aviation. In an era when planes looked like powered kites and crashed more often than they landed, Franz thought, if you're going to fall, at least do it with style. He designed it, tested it, attached it to a mannequin, and most of the time, it fell free. But he still believed. Ignoring advice from friends and warnings from the police, Franz decided, try it himself. And the stage? The top of the Eiffel Tower. In 1912, under the glare of the press, he appeared in a self-designed flying suit, stood on the edge of the tower, waved, and jumped. The suit did not open, did not flare, did not work. Franz plummeted to the ground like a tailor's brick, leaving a crater, a twisted suit, and an awkward silence in the crowd. Franz Reichelt, the tailor who flies straight into destiny. If Franz's story weren't tragic, it would be a perfect joke of fate. A man tried to make falling safe by falling himself. He died doing what he loved, inventing. Unfortunately, his last invention was also his last moment. History, as usual, can be cruel. It doesn't remember him as a tailor, nor as an inventor. It only remembers him as the flying tailor, who dreamed of the sky and landed on the ground. Strong. Valerian, the emperor who was turned into furniture. If you think being a Roman emperor means living in eternal glory, having grapes peeled and presented on a silver platter, let me introduce you to Valerian, the only person in history to be taken prisoner and turned into a footstool. Valerian ruled the 3rd century, a time when Rome was like an overcooked lasagna, cracked, runny, and messy. Plagues, civil wars, tribes storming cities, each year was a chaotic feast of self-serving disaster. And then, Valerian decided to deal with the Persians, specifically King Shapur, a man with no patience, especially with Roman bombast. He led his army east, and was wiped out at the Battle of Edessa. Valerian was captured alive, a rarity in those days. Keeping an emperor was like catching a unicorn in a bear trap. Do you think Shapur would demand ransom? Or political bargaining? No. Shapur rode on his back. Not metaphorically. Every time he mounted his horse, Shapur called Valerian out, made him kneel, and used him as a footstool, publicly. Every day. The humiliation wasn't just personal, it was choreographed. And when you think it can't get any worse, it does. After years of humiliation, Valerian dies in prison. There are many versions of history, but the most colorful one says, Shapur skinned him, stuffed him with straw, and displayed him in the temple as a trophy. A message to Rome, a victory for Persia, and the worst day in the life of any specimen collector. Rome, of course, didn't take kindly to this. They pretended he evaporated, perhaps retired by the sea, sipping wine. Who knows? But history remembers. An emperor defeated by pride, poor tactics, and a king whose sense of humor was a little too much. Adolf Frederick, the king defeated by cake. Now comes Sweden, and a death that sounds like something out of a diet book. Meet Adolf Frederick, the 18th century king of Sweden, not known for war, reform, or philosophy. No. He is remembered for eating himself to death. Not in the metaphorical sense of devouring power. Literally. Dying by the buffet. The fateful day. Fat Tuesday, 1771, the last day before Lent. The perfect excuse to eat and drink. And Adolf held nothing back. History records. Lobster, caviar, sauerkraut, smoked herring, champagne, and 14 servings of semla, his favorite dessert. Semla. A cardamom-scented dough pastry filled with almonds and whipped cream, floating in warm milk. Delicious, light, harmless. Until you eat 14 in a row. After that epic meal, he started complaining of stomach pains. History calls it digestion. Today, it can be summed up as death by hunger. This death shocked the people. One minute he was a king, the next he was defeated by cream and almonds. No rebellion, no daggers, just too much dessert. Diogenes, the philosopher who gave up breathing. It's time to talk about Diogenes of Sinope, the rebel philosopher, the ultimate minimalist, and possibly history's most famous pottery man. He was the poster boy for cynicism, or, to put it bluntly, living without caring what anyone thought, wearing the same clothes all year long, and sleeping in a pot. He believed that the good life didn't require wealth, social expectations, or nice clothes. And he practiced it, openly, loudly, sometimes quite shamelessly. So how did he end up? Ancient sources are contradictory, always an interesting sign in history. One of the most famous versions, he held his breath until he died. Not accidental asphyxiation, but, I'm done. No more breathing. A philosophical mic drop, or a final act of stubbornness, depending on how you look at it. Some say he died from eating a live octopus. Others say he was bitten by a dog, which, frankly, is too Diogynesian. But the holding breath version has lived the longest, perhaps because it is so Diogynesian. This is the man who once walked at noon with a lantern, saying he was looking for a good man. He was also the man who told Alexander the Great, the most powerful man in the world at the time, to move aside, you are blocking my sunlight. So, why did he choose to stop breathing? Because he was so bored with humanity. It was so reasonable that it was scary. And the best part, society, which he mocked all his life, honored him with a public grave. In the end, people still remember him, not because he lived the way he did, but because he lived the way he did. Crassus, the gilded death of Rome's richest man. Now we come to Marcus Licinius Crassus, a man so rich that other Roman millionaires looked like potters on a market. He had silver mines, real estate, thousands of slaves, and yes, a private fire brigade. If your house was on fire, Crassus would come and offer to buy it. If you sold it, he would save it. If not, sorry. But money wasn't enough. Crassus wanted glory, like Caesar, Pompey. So in 53 BC, he decided to attack Parthia, the wealthy eastern kingdom. The Roman version of, "Hold my wine, I'll handle this." The result? Disaster. He led his army into the desert, and fell into a trap. The Romans were massacred. His son died. The morale of the army collapsed like an aqueduct after the budget was cut. Crassus was captured, and the Parthians knew exactly who he was, the richest man in Rome. So they chose a special punishment: pouring molten gold down his throat. That's right, his death was more a theatrical statement than an execution. A tragic message. You want gold? Here, swallow it. Some say it's a legend, but whether it's true or not, it spread through Rome like wildfire. Because that's what history loves best. Poetic justice is more interesting than boring truth. Crassus became a lesson in greed, and the folly of demanding more when you already have it all. Shield. Next part. Spartacus, the last man standing. Do you want me to continue writing about Spartacus, the man behind the famous, "I am Spartacus," line, with this storytelling style? Spartacus, the man who would not fall. Now comes Spartacus, the man who not only fought, but refused to fall. Thrown into the brutal world of the Roman arena, where there were no mystical teachers like Hogwarts, only whips and bread if you were lucky. Spartacus survived, then rebelled. In 73 BC, with about 70 gladiators, he escaped using kitchen knives and anything that wasn't nailed to the floor. Soon they were defeating the Roman patrols, then attracting thousands of runaway slaves and outcasts. A full-scale revolt in the heart of proud Rome. For 2 years, Spartacus led this rebel army. They defeated trained legions, embarrassed Roman generals, and kept the Senate awake. But Rome was not used to being humiliated for long. And who was sent to quell the rebellion? Marcus Licinius Crassus, yes, the hot gold drinker from earlier, because nothing says repentance like having wealth poured down your throat. Eventually, Spartacus and his army were cornered in southern Italy, surrounded, with no way back, but he did not surrender. He charged, true Spartacus style, slashing through his enemies, heading straight for Crassus as if in a contest of who was more tired of living. Stabbed multiple times, he fought on, then disappeared into the chaos. No body was found. No triumphal arch. No king led back to Rome in chains. Just gone. Rome crucified over 6,000 men along the Appian Way, a warning in the flesh. But there was no getting away from the fact that one man who started with a kitchen knife nearly brought down the pride of an entire empire. Spartacus didn't just die, he refused to fall. And that resonated far beyond any throne. Demisippus, Rome's most unfeeling death. In the chaotic final days of the Roman Republic, when political intrigue broke out over lunch and bloodshed replaced debate, a name flashed before fading. Lucius Junius Brutus Demisippus. Not a familiar figure, he was a general loyal to Marius, one half of the Marius versus Sulla duo, the Roman version of he who speaks louder lies. When Sulla returned from the east with his rock-solid army, Rome braced for a storm. Demisippus, loyal to the end, was caught in Sulla's purge, a kind of spring cleaning but with swords instead of brooms. He was sentenced to death along with a group of other officials. And as they were led away to be executed, one of them burst into tears, begging for his life. Demisippus turned, laughed, and said calmly, "What are you crying about, fool? Don't you know what I came here for?" No pleading, no begging for a last meal. Just a cold quip and a determined walk toward death. Not a great general, not a history changer, but he died more gracefully than most kings or philosophers. And sometimes, history doesn't need you to be great. It just needs you to die in style. Caligula. The man, the horse, and the hallucinatory assembly. In 37 AD, there was a brief moment when Caligula seemed like Rome's golden sun. Then, the cheese slipped off the cracker. His reign quickly descended into a post-reality drama, where the line between divinity and madness was blurred. He declared himself a god. He forced people to worship him. He even made his horse a senator. Yes, the horse. It had marble stables, a jeweled collar, and, by some accounts, better table manners than the Senate. Caligula executed anyone who blinked suspiciously. He declared war on Poseidon, god of the sea, and ordered his soldiers to pick up seashells as spoils of war after a sea battle. Finally, his personal guard, the men who were paid to protect him, decided it was time to put on a show. In 41 AD, they surrounded him in the palace basement. No flowery farewells. No grand speeches. Just stabbings. Lots of stabbings. Some say more than 30 wounds. It was no longer an assassination, but an emotional group project. The body was dumped in a shallow pit. No state funeral. No farewell song. Just the end of a man who once tried to replace statues of gods with his own. And though his reign was a real delirium, Caligula is remembered, not for his wisdom or reforms, but for turning Rome into a pearl-studded mad circus. George Plantagenet. Wine, betrayal, and a grape-flavored death. During a period known as the Wars of the Roses, or the dragonless, silk-filled version of Game of Thrones, there was a prince named George Plantagenet, Duke of Clarence. His brother was King Edward IV. His brother was Richard III. The position was quite impressive, but George had two fatal weaknesses. Ambition. Lack of keeping his mouth shut. He changed sides like he changed clothes, betraying each other like it was a national sport. Eventually, Edward IV got fed up. But executing brothers was not easy. A peaceful solution was needed. According to the records, George was given a choice of how to die. And he chose. Drowned in a barrel of Malmsey wine. Not beheaded, not hanged. Dying in wine, a choice that can only be described as having a good taste. The truth? Maybe just a legend. But it was all too fitting for George, who lived like a royal party that never ended. He was buried in Westminster Abbey, but in the popular mind, he was a man who drank too much, literally. Archimedes. Let me draw the circle. Archimedes was a genius. A man looked at a puddle and invented hydrodynamics. Built a pulley, a catapult, and, possibly, a mirror that burned ships with the sun. But not good at socializing. In 212 BC, Rome took Syracuse. The soldiers poured in, and there, in the dust, Archimedes was still drawing a circle. Thinking, enthralled. A Roman soldier approached, and Archimedes, unafraid, just looked up and said, "Don't mess with my circle. No begging for mercy, no good evening. Just asking for respect for geometry." The soldier, no love of mathematics, killed him on the spot. A purely administrative death for an extraordinary mind. The Roman general Marcellus ordered Archimedes to be spared, but orders were defeated by impatience and a misplaced sword. The lesson: if you're solving a metaphysical equation, look up every now and then. King Henry I. The pose that killed a man. Henry I of France, not a remarkable man. He didn't go into battle shirtless. He didn't throw wild parties. Just a normal king in a very normal time, the Middle Ages. He lived a peaceful life, built a few churches, put down a few rebellions. But, one day, after sitting for a while, maybe in a meeting, maybe in prayer, he stood up too quickly, and fell. And died. Maybe a stroke, maybe low blood pressure. In those days, doctors waved leaves, complained of bad spirits, and bled. Sadly, blood is not Wi-Fi, bleeding doesn't help. Henry, who had survived war and treason, was defeated by the pose of standing up. Not a heroic death, but very human. Cleopatra Selene II. The moon that refused to go. Her name means moon, and like the moon, Cleopatra Selene was often overshadowed by larger, louder celestial bodies, namely, her parents. Cleopatra VII, queen, goddess, icon, and Mark Antony, general, handsome, occasional disaster. When their world fell apart in 30 BCE, it happened in true operatic style. Octavian, later Augustus, showed up. Her parents committed suicide together, with daggers and snakes, very much on brand. And Selene, then a young woman, was taken to Rome, not as a hostage, but as a trophy. She was paraded through the streets in chains in Rome's version of a triumphal procession. But here's the twist: she survived. While history prefers drama, Selene was strategic. She lived, she adapted, she played the game. Augustus, impressed, or at least mildly amused, arranged her marriage to King Juba II of Mauritania, a learned, Romanized African king. So Cleopatra Selene, born in the shadow of the pyramid, became queen again, this time in a Roman client kingdom, with fewer sphinxes and more Senate-approved budgets. And she ruled well, extremely well. Coins were minted in her name. Cities were built in a mix of Egyptian, Roman, and Greek styles. She wore the crescent-shaped crown of her namesake and is said to have maintained the cult of Isis in her new kingdom, a living reminder of her mother's lost empire. We don't know exactly when she died. Around 5 BC, the historical record is silent, as if the moon had simply dipped below the horizon. But what a legacy it was! She overcame the empire that destroyed her family, rebuilt her power in exile, and died not in flames but in dignity. In a world that worships martyrs and soap operas, Cleopatra Selene too chose something much harder. Survival. Grace under chains. Reign without revenge. Cleopatra Selene II, Queen of Interplay. Conclusion. Cleopatra Selene has always lived on the margins, not erased, but rewritten. Not quite Egyptian, not quite Roman, and certainly not Juba's quiet wife lurking in the shadows. She was a hybrid ruler in a hybrid world, and she wielded that complexity as a weapon, subtle, strategic, and undeniably effective. Her death came quietly, around 5 BC. There was no monumental fall, no great betrayal, just silence and then, legacy. Juba continued to rule after her, and though he wrote many books and styled himself a scholar king, Selene's mark remains in the architecture, coinage, policies, and multicultural soul of Mauritania. A kingdom born of conquest, redefined by a girl who was paraded as a trophy. No memoirs survive, no statues in Rome, no romantic poets sang her praises in Latin. But her life was a masterpiece of diplomacy, resilience, and reinvention. She needed no tragedy to be remembered. She claimed power and held it, not by bloodshed, but by balance. In a world where queens are often footnotes or cautionary tales, Cleopatra Selene became something rarer. A king who rebuilt not what was lost, but what could be. A daughter of the empire who outlived the empire and then built an empire of her own. The reason Cleopatra and her legacy are still debated is that while Cleopatra Selene's bloodline may have ended, her influence endured for generations. Coins bearing her image and the Egyptian cults she supported survived, while the cities she founded, such as Caesarea, became centers of commerce and learning under Roman rule. Cleopatra's legacy lives on not in a thunderbolt, but in the gradual change of civilization. Although she did not have a grand tomb, she built a kingdom and had far-reaching policies. Cleopatra Selene was not a victim of history, but its great architect. Her son, Ptolemy of Mauritania, continued her legacy. As the last of the Ptolemaic dynasty, he was a model of ambition, legend, and survival. Ptolemy grew up in the splendor of the kingdom his mother had created, inheriting not only a kingdom but also a political legacy. Although he did not achieve the same great transformation as his mother, he brought prosperity to Mauritania, tying it to Rome. However, Rome remained distrustful of his ancient legacy, and eventually, under the Emperor Caligula, Ptolemy was executed without a formal trial. Although Cleopatra's reign ended abruptly with the death of her son, her influence remained, even in the changes of the Roman Empire. Mauritania was incorporated into Rome, but it still carried her legacy through its cities and temples, showing that, despite the end, Cleopatra's legacy endures. Cleopatra's story also reflects another period in history, when culture, knowledge, and heritage were preserved in forms such as Ashurbanipal's library in Nineveh. This king built a huge library to collect, organize and protect the intellectual heritage of Mesopotamia. The clay tablets recorded not only knowledge but also the cultural treasures of the entire empire, from medicine to astronomy. This library was not just a place to store books, but also a giant project to protect and preserve all human wisdom. Ashurbanipal's library became a symbol of sustainability through fire and time, while Egyptian culture also maintained its longevity through the houses of life, the first libraries, where priests and scholars protected the secrets and power of knowledge. Although Egyptian books were invaded and burned, fragments survived through tombs, allowing their wisdom to live on in the cracks of history. In short, although empires have collapsed, their cultural and intellectual legacies still exist, stretching across the centuries. There were upheavals. The forests disappeared. The Rapa Nui people grew smaller, their bodies gaunt, tired, and ravaged by generations of hardship. Those who traveled with Roggeveen noted the statues and the desolate landscape, but did not understand the civilization that had created them. And then the outsiders kept coming. Over the next 2 centuries, European contact brought devastation to Rapa Nui. Whalers, missionaries, traders, and slavers arrived, each leaving their mark, most of them erasing more than they recorded. By the end of the 19th century, the population had dwindled to just over 100 people. Colonial powers had divided Rapa Nui land and leased it to sheep ranchers, fenced off ancestral sites, and restricted Rapa Nui access to the Moai. Even access to the Moai was restricted. The statues, once living symbols of family and power, were now silent monuments, abandoned, looted, or turned into curiosities for foreign explorers and collectors. European archaeologists took the statues, ceremonial objects, and even human remains, shipping them to museums in London, Paris, and Santiago. Some Moai had their feet cut off and were put on display thousands of miles from their sacred places. The island became a textbook example of cultural obliteration. But the Rapa Nui never forgot who they were. Even in enforced silence, they carried the memory of Mai. Traditions lived on, hidden, whispered, passed down in fragments. And slowly, over the centuries, the people began to reclaim the stories carved in stone. But first, the world had to learn to listen. In the 20th and 21st centuries, the Rapa Nui people began a slow but determined process of cultural recovery and restoration. The Moai, once toppled and buried by time, conflict, and neglect, were gradually re-erected. This time, they were not just monuments to the past, but symbols of resilience. In the 1950s, the famous Norwegian explorer Thor Heyerdahl brought international attention to Easter Island. Although many of his theories were incorrect, especially his views on South American influence, his work helped to spark global archaeological interest and curiosity. Researchers from around the world flocked to the island, not to plunder as before, but to study and restore. Restoration efforts began in earnest. Fallen Moai were re-erected on O pedestals. Coral eyes were recreated. The Pakau hats were returned. Ancient roads, quarries and ceremonial sites were surveyed and studied. A clearer picture of the Rapa Nui civilization began to emerge, not one of mystery, but of technical excellence, spiritual depth and cultural complexity. However, the most important voices were no longer those of foreign scholars. They were those of the Rapa Nui people themselves. Descendants of the original builders began to restore language, rituals and land ownership. In 2017, Chile formally transferred control of Rapa Nui National Park, which contains most of the island's archaeological remains, back to the Rapa Nui community. Local people now oversee the care of the Moai, and decisions about excavation and preservation are made with cultural sensitivity and ancestral knowledge. New generations are learning the stories of their ancestors not just from books, but from elders, songs, dances, and the Moai themselves. Efforts to decipher Rangarongo, the island's mysterious writing system, continue with cautious hope, and global institutions, including the British Museum and the Louvre, are facing growing pressure to return the moai and sacred artifacts taken during the colonial era.